אוקיי, תודה רבה דורון. אנחנו נעבור עכשיו להרצאה מוקלטת של ג'ורג גאן, שהוזכר גם בהרצאות הקודמות, שהוא אחד המקימים והמובילים של החברה הבינלאומית לשיקום אקולוגי, שחלק אני משער שלא מעט מהאנשים שיושבים פה השתתפו בכנסים שלה. עכשיו, בנוסף לזה שהוא היה באמת פעיל בזירה הבינלאומית ובאמת תרם רבות, גם בכתיבת המסמך שאחר כך יוצג בהמשך, וגם בארגון וקביעת הסטנדרטים של השיקום, הוא גם פעל בשטח, בעיקר בדרום ארצות הברית, אבל גם במקומות אחרים, כך שהידע שלו הוא ידע רב-תחומי, שמשלב גם ידע אקולוגי רחב וגם את ההבנה שבאמת כדי לעשות שיקום, כדי לעשות פרויקטים מוצלחים של שיקום, אנחנו צריכים להגיע לקשר טוב גם עם הקהילה, להתחשב בצרכים אחרים, עם ארגונים לא ממשלתיים. אלה דברים שהוא ידגיש בהרצאה שלפנינו.
Good morning and thank you. I'm honored to be making this presentation to help open this launch event for Israel's adaptation of the Society for Ecological Restoration Standards for Restoration Practice, which I hope will result in new opportunities to assess, plan, implement, and monitor standards-based ecological restoration in Israel and in the surrounding regions. Today I'm speaking to you as the Global Policy Lead for the Society for Ecological Restoration, and before I begin, I would like to again thank Noam Ben Moshe and his colleagues for this opportunity. As a short introduction, I am based in Florida in the southeastern United States, where I have practiced ecological restoration for 50 years. My work on global policy is based on the idea that any standards or other guidance that I help develop must be practical and contribute to improving my own projects and those of my many practitioner colleagues from around the world. At the same time, the guidance must be rigorous, science-based, and reflect current knowledge and thinking in this rapidly developing field. Today, I would like to accomplish 5 basic things. I would like to introduce the Society for Ecological Restoration, to discuss the global context for ecological restoration and the work that we do, to describe the evolution of restoration standards, and then the application of those standards to Israel and the Middle East, and then finally to respond to some pre-submitted questions. As an introduction, SER is a global community of more than 5,000 members distributed across more than 130 countries. For a professional society, SER is very interesting in terms of the mix of individual and institutional members, from scientists and researchers to practitioners, representatives from government agencies, indigenous peoples, private sector owners and employees, students and emerging professionals, and local communities, artists, and volunteers. And here is a slightly dated map to give you an idea of our global coverage by country. In addition to basic membership, SER is organized into chapters, thematic groups, and student associations around the world. While emerging from North America, SER has worked hard to reach out to the global restoration community and ensure that members from all global regions are represented within the organization and have a voice in defining the future of the field. SER publishes the peer-reviewed journal Restoration Ecology and since 2020, the thematic series on arid lands. SER supports restoration practice, including through field trips, webinars, regional and world conferences, and our growing certified ecological restoration practitioner program. SER also engages on a wide policy front, including through our work on the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and on Target 2, the restoration target, for the Global Biodiversity Framework. Now let's look at the policy context for ecological restoration. Restoration in the broad sense, and ecological restoration specifically, was largely ignored by the global conservation and sustainable development communities until the Convention on Biological Diversity's IG targets were agreed in 2011. The exception was the Convention on Wetlands, or the Ramsar Convention, which issued principles and guidelines for wetland restoration in 2002. Since 2011, however, there has been a rapid increase in global targets and programs that call for large-scale restoration to counter the triple crises of climate change, the biodiversity or extinction crisis, and land degradation. However, as we will discuss later, some of these initiatives have had rather loose definitions of restoration, and some activities done in the name of restoration have caused damage rather than helping to restore nature or improve human well-being. Furthermore, much of the earlier work on restoration was tied to the mitigation of damage to native ecosystems rather than being proactive. One of the most important recent initiatives is the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which defined ecosystem restoration very broadly based on the restorative continuum published by SER in 2019. In this context, ecosystem restoration includes all restorative activities, from reducing societal impacts to remediating pollution, to rehabilitation focusing on the recovery of ecosystem functions and the delivery of ecosystem services, to ecological restoration, or the restoration of native ecosystems. More recently, there have been national and regional efforts to create legal and regulatory frameworks for restoration, such as the biodiversity net gain legislation in the United Kingdom and the nature restoration law in the European Union. These two examples are quite different, however, as the biodiversity net gain legislation is tied to development and impacts to nature, while the EU regulation is proactive, calling for restoration first in areas already with some degree of protection. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or the GBF, which is an agreement within the Convention on Biological Diversity, is also oriented toward taking proactive steps to restore ecosystems for people and nature. Target 2, which aims to place 30% of degraded areas under effective restoration by 2030, is also closely aligned with the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. For those of you who are interested, SER helped to produce this high-level guidance on Target 2, which aims to assist countries in delivering restoration outcomes for biodiversity and human well-being, as called for in Target 2. We used a large number of documents to produce this guidance, including documents agreed by the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, such as the Short-Term Action Plan on Ecosystem Restoration from 2016, all the way to documents written since the Global Biodiversity Framework is agreed in 2022, such as the guide produced by a consortium of organizations in support of Target 3 on protected areas. We produced this figure to demonstrate the importance of restoration across all 23 targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. As you can see, many targets are mutually supportive with Target 2, such as spatial planning and protected areas, while other targets are supported by Target 2 or support Target 2. But the reality is that restoration runs through the entire Global Biodiversity Framework and is incredibly important to all aspects of the GBF. Because Target 2 calls for restoration in terrestrial, inland waters, and coastal and marine ecosystems, we improved the restorative continuum to emphasize that restoration needs to occur in all of these major ecosystem groups. We also flattened the continuum to emphasize that all restorative activities are important. Yes, we want as much ecological restoration as possible, but all of these other activities have value. We also spent quite a bit of time in the Target 2 guide to make sure that people understood the difference between rehabilitation and ecological restoration. And on the left, so we have rehabilitation, and in this case, our focus is on the restoration of ecosystem functions and the delivery of ecosystem services. And so this is the primary outcome, or the required outcome of rehabilitation. And we also want to support the recovery of biodiversity and ecosystem integrity. Where we can, we want to improve connectivity. Whereas with ecological restoration, which is the only way to increase the spatial extent of native or natural ecosystems, a primary outcome has to be not only the ecosystem functions and services, but biodiversity and ecosystem integrity. And again, where we can, we want to increase connectivity. but it is sometimes it's very difficult to do that. For example, in urban areas or in very intensive agricultural landscapes where connectivity is hard to rebuild. At the end of the day, one of the most important things that came out of the Target 2 guidance is this description of effective restoration. So Target 2 calls for 30% of degraded areas to be under effective restoration by 2030. So what does this mean exactly? What do we mean by effective restoration? And we had a lot of discussions about this, and this description or definition is what we came up with, and it supports the idea of standards-based restoration. So in the guide, effective restoration is defined as standards-based restoration underpinned by agreed principles that results in appropriately balanced, sustainable net gain that benefits and enhances biodiversity, ecosystem integrity, and human well-being. And this is critically important because now it elevates the idea that we're going to use principles and we're going to use standards to support our work, but that we also have to have positive outcomes. We actually have to be able to demonstrate that we're meeting the intent of the target in terms of delivering for both people and nature. So in this next section, we're going to take a look at the evolution of restoration standards and bring it up to the present day and show the context for the work that you all have been doing and that you're going to discuss today. So since 2016, the Society for Ecological Restoration has been working very hard in the global policy space around standards and certification. And so there's really three different components of this work that I want to draw your attention to. The first are the standards themselves, so standards, guidelines, and principles, and we'll talk a little bit more about the detail of those in a moment. The second is the certification of restoration practitioners, or the CERP program. So certifying people to demonstrate that that practitioners have the skills and experience that are necessary to carry out the work. And then the third part, the part that is under development currently, is the idea of certifying restoration projects. So developing the standards that underpin certification so that ultimately SER can certify projects as being effective, as being standards-based. So it's important to understand where these standards came from. And the work that we started in 2016 with the first edition of the SER standards really grew out of a need to counter some of the things that were happening around some of these big global initiatives like the Bond Challenge. So however well-intentioned, the Bond Challenge and other initiatives called for very large areas of degraded land to be placed under restoration, or in fact to achieve restoration by very short time periods. These different initiatives, these different challenges or targets had some repercussions that were problematic. So for example, the idea basically came down to planting trees. So restoration became about planting trees, which is not about ecological restoration at all. In some cases, it's not about rehabilitation or anything on the restorative continuum. And so people were planting trees in grasslands or in other biodiverse ecosystems, and there was immediately a huge pushback from the science community, from the conservation community, saying, hey, wait, we need to stop and think about this for a moment, because we're actually causing collateral damage by planting trees. And so there needs to be some thinking about it. And so the first version of the SER standards was really oriented around about putting something on the table that would help people to think more clearly about what we meant by restoration, what was positive, what was not restoration at all, and to provide a framework for people to begin to talk about that in a more formal and structured way. One thing that is important to note is that the first version of the SER standards, which were launched at the same COP as the short-term action plan on ecosystem restoration, as preliminary as they were based on a tremendous amount of work that came before, such as the primer on ecological restoration, which was first published in 2002, and the global rationale for ecological restoration that was produced in collaboration with the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management. So we put the standards on the table in 2016, and we immediately began working with different practitioners and scientists and people around the world to improve the standards right away. And so we worked toward the second edition that was released in 2019 that addressed some of the shortcomings and criticisms of that first version. But it was critically important that that first version was launched in 2016 so that we could begin the conversation about what we meant by ecological restoration and to begin the process of defining effective restoration. But not only did we work on the 2019 version, the second edition, but also we began to work on standards for specific sectors, such as mine sites, or for certain kinds of practices like restoration, seed-based restoration, and also to collaborate with other organizations such as the Nature Conservancy, for example, to produce guidelines that were aligned with our standards, such as the standards that were developed for shellfish reefs. And this leads us to the work that you have been doing here with the Israeli adaptation of the 2019 standards. And this is all aligned with the vision of how this work will progress, where we have the 2019 standards as the basis, and then we're developing specific guidance for sectors or biomes or geographies to address the specific concerns and context for those different situations. So the question above and beyond the obvious high-level issues such as addressing collateral damage are the more nuanced questions of why do we need standards of practice. So just to go over some of these points, one of the things that we want to do is improve the overall quality of ecological restoration projects and their associated outcomes in both landscapes and seascapes. We want to build a common foundation for the practice of ecological restoration and ecosystem restoration so that we have a common language so that we understand what we're talking about and we can communicate effectively. We want to reduce risk and uncertainty associated with restoration design and implementation. For projects that have an economic investment, we want to increase the return on that restoration investment. We want to create consistency in restoration design and delivery, and this is critically important, without stifling innovation and creativity. And so one of the early criticisms that came out of the 2016 version, the first version of the standards, was that standards would stifle creativity. And because restoration is such a new field and people are developing new ideas all the time, that was seen as a real shortcoming. But we've been able to demonstrate that in fact is not happening, that providing standards actually can increase innovation and creativity. And so that's a really critically important point when we're talking about standards. We also want to improve opportunities for quality assurance and quality control, and as we'll talk about a little bit later, provide a basis for project certification. So to build on the point that I made earlier, is what we're ultimately aiming to do is to produce a body of work that includes complementary standards to underpin effective restoration. So it's less important which standards people are using than it is that they are using standards. And so the development of the Israeli adaptation of the standards is seen as a great contribution to the field, as is some of these others, such as standards to underpin certification or standards for ecosystem restoration, that is to define restoration, provide guidance along the entire restorative continuum, and so forth. And so what we're trying to do, collaborating with our colleagues around the world is to try and make sure that these different standards are aligned, that they use, again, a common language, to the extent possible, common definitions, where things are different, that we understand what those differences are and why they're important and so forth. One of the things that ties these different standards together is the restorative continuum, which we have discussed. Some tools that have widespread use are the 5-star system, ecological recovery wheel, and social benefits wheel, which are highly useful in helping to plan, monitor, and report on ecological restoration, and in some cases, rehabilitation. The ecological 5-star system is especially helpful in defining the reference model for ecological restoration, or the high integrity condition of the ecosystem we are seeking to restore. The wheels and the attribute and sub-attribute tables for the 5-star systems, including updates and calibrations, are available on the SER website on this tools page. One of the adaptations that is available on the tools page is a calibration of the 5-star sub-attribute table for arid lands. As with all aspects of the standards, we are hopeful that you find the calibration helpful and would appreciate any additions, corrections, or feedback. And then finally, to wrap up this section on standards, just to mention that the standards are living, and the 3rd edition is now in production. We're still quite a ways away. They've just been submitted to Restoration Ecology, and we hope that they will get published sometime in early 2026. We will have details on how they differ, improvements that have been made, so that you can update the version that you have produced here for Israel. Very briefly, I just want to draw your attention to the amount of interest that's being generated in the private sector or in the business community about standards-based restoration, and SER is working with a large number of actors in the space, and the interest ranges from protecting and enhancing supply chains to improving local community relations, supplying key economic services related to restoration, such as what SCORE is doing in terms of providing insurance for ecological restoration projects, and then ultimately to align restoration with carbon markets, biodiversity credits, and compensatory mitigation to understand the role of these different things that are going on. As I mentioned, in terms of certification, SER began certifying practitioners in 2017. We now have about 700 certified practitioners around the world. And due to quite a bit of pressure from different places and different sectors, we are also moving quickly now into the project certification space. We've been working with, collaborating with organizations like World Wildlife Fund Spain, and with the Global Biodiversity Standard, and with the reinsurance company SCORE to develop project certification standards that can be used for various different purposes. All right, so I wanted to close with some thoughts about how the SER standards and standards in general about ecological restoration relate to or are relevant to old, very degraded landscapes such as you have in the Middle East. And what I can say is that what we have found is that, yes, it can be difficult to figure out what the reference conditions are and to take into account human activities, but in fact, the standards hold up very well, whether you're working in landscapes that have had lower impacts from recent human activity versus landscapes that are very old, where people have been living and impacting those ecosystems for very long periods of time. So just to review the situation, when we do ecological restoration, we start with a baseline condition of degradation, and we need to decide what ecosystem we want to restore. and then to create a reference model that describes what a high integrity version of that ecosystem would be, and then to be able to measure the interim conditions across time as we are deploying restoration. And so the issue is that how do we create a reference model when there has been so much degradation over such a long period of time? But the reality is that even in situations like the Middle East, there are many like this. There's many places in the world, in Africa and much of Europe and parts of Asia and so forth, where there's been human activity over a long period of time, human degradation over a long period of time, yet still we're able to figure out what the reference conditions would be for high integrity versions of those ecosystems. And so one of the questions, in addition to how do the standards hold up in these old, very degraded parts of the world, was how are the standards different between terrestrial and marine ecosystems, for example? And so I've been working with SER Europe that is doing a calibration of the 5-star system for marine ecosystems in Europe, and it's the same issue as that you might find in Israel or other parts of the Middle East, where people are coming to the table and they're saying there just are no undegraded reference sites for oyster reefs or so forth. But what we're finding is that people are actually able to construct reference models that describe the high integrity, what a high integrity system would look like. So it works both across biomes, but also across different levels of degradation. It's just a matter of trying to do the work to figure out what the high integrity version of that system is. Okay, well, I hope this has been helpful in setting the stage for today's launch of the Israeli adaptation of SER standards. And I want to close with a few thoughts that I hope further contribute to the discussions today. First, humans are part of nature, and we know that people can have a positive relationship with nature. And there are many examples of this from around the world. The goal is not a nature without people, but rather reestablishing a healthy relationship between people and nature. Thus, restoration must be built around the needs and expectations of the people who are affected by restoration, which is why stakeholder engagement is the first principle in the SER standards. Only through cooperation and buy-in by local communities can restoration flourish. Second, for restoration to be successful, we must address the drivers of degradation, and degradation, damage, or destruction of ecosystems must stop or be fundamentally mitigated. This is true no matter the cause of degradation, whether it be caused by overgrazing or conversion for agriculture or human conflict. Third, we restore toward the future, not back to the past. Ecosystems are constantly changing, and restoration planning and goal setting must take that into account. This is especially important in the face of climate change. We must envision what ecosystems can be while being informed by what they were prior to degradation. Because of this, I find that all kinds of restoration can align with the concept of standards-based effective restoration, including rewilding and climate response systems such as resist, accept, direct strategies. Many people ask questions related to translating standards into practice. Whether to build a national program or a community-based project, I think there are three critical components to putting restoration into practice and sustaining it long enough to make an impact. One, to build a community of support across a wide range of actors, from landowners and rights holders to practitioners to scientists and government personnel. To build locally relevant tools, protocols, and procedures that distill the standards into practice. We don't need everyone to read the standards, but rather we need the standards to be integrated into the frameworks of practice. 3, share information, treat all knowledge holders as peers, learn from practice, and help apply what you have learned as broadly as possible. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I wish you a productive and informative meeting today. Thank you so much.